Bueno, buenos días.
Good morning. Now we are going to start this international conference about people who live with HIV, LGTB community. And we want to welcome all the people who are here now to attend this conference. As we are delayed, I won't be long now. Just to say that from our organization, we've considered it necessary to update people about the situation of AIDS in the world today and to talk about the principles of Denver. As you know, this is a complete different setting that we have nowadays. So we're going to start with the first table and the interview with Richard Berkowitz. So I give the floor to Michael, who is going to carry out the interview. Welcome. Good morning. And I want to thank the organizers. From now on, the interview will be in English. So those of you who need to listen in Spanish, please use the headphones. So the idea is that it's going to be a kind of conversation. So I invite you to make comments, ask questions. So there will be a microphone going round. If not, if you don't feel comfortable asking in English, there's going to be a translation. And here's the microphone. Buenos días.
Let me start with an introduction. Richard Berkowitz, he was born and raised in New Jersey, and while he was in college, he organized the first gay rights protest in that state.
Yes.
And so you were very young when you started with protest. And after college, you moved to New York City in 1978 and earned your living as an S&M hustler. That's right?
Yes.
Okay. Just checking if everything. Even before AIDS was recognized as a syndrome, Berkowitz became concerned about protecting his clients, many of whom were married, and protecting them from sexual transmitted diseases. Later, together with Michael Collin, they organized one of the first people with AIDS groups in the East Coast. Collin and Berkowitz met through the doctor Joe Sonneveld in 1982, and they wrote in 1983 the pamphlet "How to Have Sex in an Epidemic: One Approach," which is considered as the first sex-positive guide to practicing safe sex. That was an important event, and as they were working on the east side, there were also people working on the west side of the west coast of the United States, and they met all together when they attended the second National AIDS Forum in 1983, that was organized by the National Lesbian and Gay Health Conference, and they connected and started the conversations which ended up in the Denver Principles, drafted during that conference. And I just wanted to take one sentence from that, which I think it's very important, which says the Denver Principles. It says, "We condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term that implies defeat. And we are only occasionally patients, a term that implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS." So that was an important statement which made a huge difference before and after that conference. And the Denver Principles are still one of the most important principles we have nowadays for people living with HIV. So after the Denver conference, 5 of the activists, one of them was Richard, was starting the National Association of People Living with AIDS. Later in 2008, they made a documentary which is called Sex Positive, directed by Daryl Wynn, and was a winner in 2008 of the Outcast Grand Jury Prize for Best Documentary. The film is still, you can still watch the film and download it on the internet. So this was my introduction, Richard. I hope it was a correct introduction, and I would like to start to ask you to talk a little bit about the early years. So would you be able to talk about the context, how that all happens when AIDS interrupted our gay life?
Got it. I came out, like most of the gay men who came together in Denver and wrote the Denver Principles, most of us were products of the Stonewall Revolution, what started the modern gay rights movement. The men who started it had one experience, which was that it was really difficult navigating an LGBTQ lifestyle before the Stonewall. But once this revolution started, word kind of spread like wildfire, and a new generation, my generation, those of us who wrote the Denver Principles generation, really were the benefits of the activists that came before us. But there really was a generational divide between people my age and people like Larry Kramer, the ones who came before. So the first conflict that the gay men who wrote the Denver Principles had to confront was the issue of our generation having a lot less shame about being gay and not being uncomfortable talking about our sexual lifestyles, which no matter what anybody says, when AIDS started, everyone assumed that there was a sexually transmitted component to the disease. No one knew what the cause was, but based on common epidemiology, it was assumed that something sexually transmitted was going on, whether it was one thing, more than one thing, whatever. So the generation who created Stonewall saw sexual liberation as like the pinnacle of all their suffering and all their oppression and all their difficulties in finally coming out and rebelling. And they thought that acting on any sexual desire that came your way was the best way to be a gay man, that it was the greatest gift of gay liberation. My generation of gay men, the ones that wrote the Denver Principles, we were like kids watching television when the civil rights movement was exploding on TV, when the women's movement was starting, when the anti-war movement was in its heyday. And so we grew up as kids watching people standing up to power, questioning experts, questioning the government, holding the government accountable, distrusting experts and established institutions. And whether we completely understood as kids, really what came out of all that was that there are times in life when you have to stand up and fight for yourself. You can't let other people determine your value as a person or tell you what to think. And probably most importantly, the establishment, the government, the institutions that the government supports never cared about minorities, never really cared about women, and certainly never cared about LGBTQ people. So the idea of putting your trust in the government and in the kind of institutions that would begin to respond to the epidemic was just not an option. So when AIDS started, you had the generation, the Stonewall generation, one before me, us, who had promoted promiscuity, had celebrated promiscuity, and really faced a very painful possibility that maybe the lifestyle that they had promoted and championed might end up killing their own people. And whether they realized it or not, and I'm not sure it was completely conscious, they were extremely uncomfortable talking about this sexually transmitted component that was obvious to most people who saw what was happening when AIDS began. My generation, who got the gifts of the hard work of the previous generation, we had no trouble talking about anal sex, getting fucked, going to the baths. I mean, it was second nature to us, but it wasn't all we were. I mean, people think of the 70s, the urban gay 70s, as a time of incredible sexual freedom and liberation, and it was. But almost as important, and maybe even more important, was that for people who came from suburbs and small towns and migrated to San Francisco and New York City to be a part of a place and a community where they didn't have to hide who they were, where they could find love, where they could find friends, where they could find sex. Really, the most important thing that came out of the 70s was the openness of same-sex friendships. Lesbians, gay men, transgender. The idea that we grew up in closeted towns, we grew up where we didn't know other people like ourselves. So it wasn't just sex that was going on, it was friendship, brotherhood, sisterhood. It really was more than sex that mattered to my generation. So when AIDS began, and some of us started showing signs of the disease, and most of the early reports said, we don't know what's going on, but it's sexually transmitted, there was this divide between my generation and the previous one about, I think the previous generation really, even though they were liberated from their shame about the stigma associated with gay sex, didn't make them uncomfortable. Just because you tell yourself you're liberated, just because you march and protest, just because you have a lot of sex, doesn't mean that doesn't make you comfortable talking about it in public. Doesn't make you comfortable discussing it in front of straight people. Doesn't make you, I think it can blind you to the possibility that what they had achieved was now maybe killing their own people. So me and the guys who created the Denver Principles, we were like the second generation, and we had no trouble discussing this. So when the first time, it was the second AIDS forum, but it was the third National Lesbian Gay Health Conference in America. So in San Francisco and New York, which is where the biggest gay communities were, several people came forward of my generation and said, you know, it wasn't like Larry Kramer talking about AIDS. It was like, I have this fucking disease, and I'm not gonna hide, and I'm scared, and I don't know what to do. And gay men seem to be as terrified and irrational as straight people, and I didn't come out of the closet to be a gay man to go back in the closet because I'm sick. And so the voices in San Francisco and New York met at this conference in May 1983, and right away it was like a war between us, because those of us in New York were absolutely convinced that the lifestyle changes of the 70s was definitely playing a role in what was happening. And the queens in San Francisco were like, no, we don't know for sure, you know, don't condemn sex. So for the 3 days during the conference, we shared one experience, that the stigma of being gay was now being repeated, and the stigma of having this new disease. And gay men who had more to fear than anybody else could be gay men were being kicked out of their apartments by other gay men. Gay men were being abandoned by friends when they showed sign of the illness. We were being treated by gay men who thought they were healthy the same way straight people had treated us before gay liberation. And it was impossible to ignore those two experiences. So the isolation that gay men felt in the early days, you know, hospitals didn't want to admit patients, funeral homes didn't want to embalm the bodies, friends disappeared when they heard you were sick, blah, blah, blah. So all of a sudden, from these two opposite ends of the country, we came together and realized that we were in this unique situation where we were like at the forefront of something that we knew was going to be like the Vietnam of our generation. So by sharing our experiences and getting over our differences about what role sexual freedom played in the development of AIDS, what role the rising epidemics of sexually transmitted infections during the 70s might have played in the development of this new disease, that we had to come together, that it was easy to overlook our differences because there was something so powerful and unique about being among the first gay men diagnosed with the disease, that after spending 3 days together, we realized that a different kind of brotherhood and a different kind of activism had to be started. An activism not by and for the gay community, not activism representing a community at risk, but activism by the people with this stigmatized disease, an activism by the people who were patients of this new disease, an activism by people who had been blessed with the fruits of the previous generation's gay liberation rebellion, made us the perfect people to come together in the early days and say, we're going to take control of this. We're not letting doctors who've always persecuted women and queer people for decades, we're not going to let doctors tell us what to think. We're not going to let doctors treat us like cattle, like patients. I mean, the medical industry had a long history of homophobia, of brutalization of people of color, women being, sent to mental institutions because there's a whole history of the medical establishment mistreating women, people of color, and gay men. And so it never was a question in us who met in Denver that we were going to bow down and become compliant patients of the medical industry. That was an extraordinary bond. And here we were at this second AIDS conference in the middle of the country, and the owners of the hotel had asked the conference organizers to take the AIDS signs down from the lobby because they were scaring the hotel guests. And we shared experiences about how other gay men at the conference were like afraid that if we touched their glass, gay men had more to fear, but they were just as germophobic in a way that united us and separated us. So after 3 days together, we started to realize when you want to change the world, when a problem comes along and you want to fight it, you want to address it, you want to educate people, you want to find out who your fellow fighters are, the best way to do that is to come up with a document that says, here's what's going on, here's who we are, and here's what we need. And that's how the Denver Principles came about. Is that too long an answer?
No. All right. So one of the slogans now of the Denver Principles, nothing about us without us.
Say it again?
Nothing about us without us.
Right.
So how did that work in practice? Sorry. Okay, sorry. I said the slogan which came out of the Denver meeting was nothing about us without us. So how did that work from there on? I
think how the Denver Principles changed the doctor-patient relationship around the world. It wasn't just that we 11 gay men who wrote this document came up with this great idea. We also understood, because of the times that we came of age in, that the women's movement had been questioning the tyranny that experts exerted over control of women's lives, that the Tuskegee experiments, where the government studied syphilis in black men by not treating them, just so they could see how the disease, would reach its final stages, that there were all these histories being opened up and discussed in the 60s that we kind of were aware of or peripherally aware of. And so it was a lot of the work of the women's movement and lesbians and the civil rights movement that made very fertile ground for us standing up to the medical establishment by saying, if we have to expect the government and medical doctors to take care of us in the AIDS epidemic, we're doomed. So the first thing we realized as gay men was that we had to take control of the situation. Mm-hmm. One of the first things we did was, because of our experiences with doctors can be very paternalistic. Bad doctors don't like patients who question them. Good doctors encourage patients to get a second opinion. Good doctors listen to a patient to find out about their whole life, not just the single problem that brought them into the office. We kind of understood this. And so probably the most important thing that came out of our talking was the idea that, as my friend Dr. Sonneman once said, that doctors should be made as accountable as plumbers. They're not gods, they're as venal and petty and prejudiced as any other people, and that in a time of crisis, a medical crisis, we had to play a much bigger role in taking control of our own health care. And so even though the work of a lot of people before us helped plant that seed, the one thing that we said was, we're not sticking with any doctor, any medical establishment that doesn't understand that we have a say in our own health care, that we have a say in our own decisions about how we would be treated as AIDS patients. And I think that resonated with a lot of subsequent generations.
And that was also applicable to investigation. I think, you know, I mean, community wanted to get involved in investigation. It was just the idea of investigators, you know, some cuts above there, trying to find some solution, but there's no way to get to the solution if you don't count with the community, with the people affected by the disease.
Right.
So how do you think, after how much influence has these principles had on the evolution of the relationship between doctor and patient nowadays?
Well, it's been recognized by the United Nations, the World Health Organization. It's been honored in medical journals. It's been championed by breast cancer activists. It's been written about by organizations in Africa. It's really become a document that's gone around the world. And it amazes me that something I was a part of in 1983, you know, still lives on, still resonates, still is being honored and celebrated. And what I really love about it is that the kind of self-empowerment we were talking about wasn't just about patients, you know, having a voice, having an equal voice in their medical decisions, but encouraging people to understand that many of us live in a world where those with power don't really care about our lives and have a history of not caring about our lives, and that we need to be informed and we need to, you know, not become our own experts. Whoever said that, that was completely mistaken. There is such a thing as expertise, but it's the role of communities and activists to find experts and to hold them accountable. And whenever you find someone who puts themselves forward as an expert, you always have to ask, are there any other opinions? Who are they? And explore other points of view before you come to a decision about who you're going to place your trust into. So it means, you know, getting a little information. It doesn't mean you become the expert. That's been a really downside that's been perverted by the work we did. It means finding real experts and finding ways to hold them accountable. Because especially these days with what's going on in healthcare in many countries in the West, and with third world or other countries who are not as economically advantaged, looking to our healthcare as like the model that they want to go after. I mean, it's really a time of crisis for healthcare in many places around the world. But the idea that people have to have a say in how those things are determined came out of the Denver Principles.
So I'm asking about how you see it nowadays, because people with HIV have a normal life perspective. They live more years, but they do have like more problems, more comorbidities, and so they have had this very good relationship with this HIV specialist. They have been known for many years. It's a long-term relationship. And then suddenly they are confronted with other specialists which don't know anything about HIV, don't know anything about relationship between doctor and patient, and then they are thrown back again to, you know, this God who says what you have to do and what not.
Right, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because if you're a person at risk for HIV, if you don't live near an urban center where there are at least some measure of community organization to give you direction or to help you navigate getting the kind of health care that you need. I mean, if you live outside of those areas, doctors can be as homophobic and oblivious and dangerous to your health as, what I'm trying to say is, if you live in places where there aren't community organizations to access, you probably live in places where there isn't a medical establishment that's really understanding of your lifestyle or even knows how to ask the right questions. If you live in an urban community where there are those resources, then it's an urban community where HIV is much more prevalent, and you're more likely to get HIV. So it's a complicated situation, but I don't think most people know about the Denver Principles. I just think that it kind of becomes part of the zeitgeist from listening to other people and from what gets written and from what you read, that people are taking a bigger role in their own health care. And, you know, as far as the HIV goes, there's the reality of everyday HIV, and then there's the reality of the HIV epidemic that we hear about, like the mainstream story about the history of AIDS, which is, I don't think it's as representative of the diverse experiences of everyday people. I mean, there are organizations in most urban communities, there are organizations that address white men, and there are organizations that address poor communities. And it's like two different worlds. And they don't always come together. And it's the stories and the narrative written by white gay men that always eclipses the stories and the experiences of poor people and people of color. And I am involved with AIDS-related organizations for poor people and people of color as someone who accesses their services. And there's so much to be learned from those experiences that circulate within those color communities of color, that don't really get over into the whole issue of PrEP. You know, my partner is now working at a community organization going into homeless shelters to educate them about PrEP, and I keep thinking, they don't know where they're sleeping tomorrow night. I mean, this is like, it's like an educated white man's view of what the problem is and what the solutions are, which may have, you know, really important, valid points to make, just don't translate into like this whole other community of people at high risk for HIV. And so there's always been this disconnect. And I think this generation is more comfortable with sexuality issues, is more sexually fluid, is more aware of the risks of STIs and HIV. And I think there's a lot of potential in young people who grew up on the internet to tap into their experience, their new experience about being the first generation that grew up being able to access sexual information and imagery in a way that my generation could never imagine. I think most of it is positive.
I think the other important point is you were the writer of the first Safe Sex Guide. Can you tell a little bit more about that? How did it work? What did it say, the guide?
Well, I wasn't the only one. I mean, I met a guy at a bathhouse in New York City in 1975 who, when we went to have sex, he pulled out a condom, and I just thought, wow, that's really strange. And then after we had this incredible sex, we started talking, and he told me that he had a lover. And intuitively, I knew that the reason he used a condom was that everyone knew that when you walked into a bathhouse, you were probably going to end up with an STD. This was right around the time that the invention of backroom bars, where you could go into a bar with your best friends on a Sunday afternoon. They would like hang up a curtain in the corner, and you can go behind the curtain, get your dick sucked, and go back to your friends and chat. I mean, sex became everywhere. It was easy, and bathhouses started exploding, and attendance was, you know, you'd have to wait an hour to get into your cubicle, and new bathhouses were opening, and it was just this explosion of commercial sex establishments. While this was going on, anybody who read a gay bar every week, like most of my friends, you could see suddenly ads appeared. You know, gay men every 3 months, you should go to this clinic or that clinic and get checked for STIs. The rule when I came out was that every 3 months, sexually active gay men should be checked for syphilis and gonorrhea, both of which could be easily detected and treated. Then something changed. Two things changed. Hepatitis A, suddenly there wasn't a pill, there wasn't a shot, there was nothing to fight it off. And then an outbreak of stomach intestinal parasites, which again were treatable with antibiotics, but it was a much brutal, expensive regimen that took months. So, and then there was the outbreak of herpes. So all of a sudden, STDs went from being an inconvenience that you could cure with a handful of antibiotics to things that weren't preventable, to things that weren't treatable, to things that you held in your system, and now we know your immune system for the rest of your life. So everything was changing, and we were having such a good time, it was hard to let that information in and to really grapple with it. It was like, oh, well, there's a shot you can get, or you only get sick for 2 weeks, or, okay, so you can't have sex for a month, but then you're back having the time of your life. But for other people, gay men I met, who I didn't realize at the time, were already moderating what they were doing sexually because the assumption that every time you went out to a commercial sex establishment, you had a really good chance of getting something, people were finding things to do to lower that risk, like the guy that I met in the bathhouse with the condom. So when AIDS started, I had taken a year off of graduate school and decided to try sex work, which I had no idea if I'd be any good at it. And I ended up attracting men who wanted a S&M top. I was a pretty angry activist that tapped into something inside me that was genuine and real and wasn't difficult to channel into a sexual thing. And so I had clients that came on a regular basis, and I really came to care about them. I mean, when I came out, I considered gay married men cowards, closet cases. But once you got to know them, you realized they were real people who were trapped in situations that they didn't know how to get out of. So I started going to my doctor, Dr. Sonnabend, to say, you know, is there anything I can do to reduce my risk of, so I would, because I was trying to protect my married clients, I would talk to, and myself, I would go to my clap doctor, Dr. Sonnabend, and ask him about ways to reduce the risk of STIs before AIDS started. So the minute AIDS started, he and I had already started this conversation, and from that conversation came the booklet, How to Have Sex in Epidemic. It was my idea to go through every sex act the way a sex worker would, and to say, okay, this is a high risk, this is a low risk, this is no risk, and to run the science of it by Sonnabend, who was a trained microbiologist. So when we came out with the booklet, How to Have Sex in Epidemic, we kind of knew we were inventing safe sex. We kind of knew that we were teaching the post-Stonewall generation not to be ashamed of their sexuality, and in fact, how to protect themselves from this new disease, and just as importantly, how to protect their sexual partners. Unfortunately, the people who were in power of the gay community, the people who had the platform, the people who had access to the media, were the generation before us, because they were older, they'd been around longer, and they did not want this to be discussed. I mean, Larry Kramer has said, I love Larry, I'm not trying to attack Larry, but you know, we have generational differences, and I think it's important to talk about it. He did not want us talking about safe sex because he thought straight people wouldn't feel sympathy for us, there would never be money for the disease. So safe sex was a really difficult thing to get out there because people were uncomfortable by it, and people were afraid for it to be discussed. But people like us who invented safe sex, who already had signs of the disease, felt like this is the only way to stop other gay men from getting sick and dying. Who cares what other people think? So that was the history of safe sex.
So there might be a parallel. I mean, you say there was this discussion, if we tell people there's a lot of sex going on, because if you want to talk about sexual transmitted infections, you have to talk about sex. Right. And if you want to fundraise for actions, you don't want to let heterosexuals know that there's a lot of sex going on. And maybe there's a parallel with what we see nowadays with PrEP. I mean, in the US it's approved, it's available, but in Europe we're still lacking of PrEP, except for some countries. But the whole time it's the whole discussion about, can we talk about PrEP? I mean, because we are afraid that people think, no, it's for gay men, they only have sex, they only think about sex, and so why should the society pay for a pill, you know, if it's a way to protect? Do you see any parallel between that? This 24-year-old straight guy made a documentary about my book, about how safe sex came about. And I think gay men have been the biggest hurdle sometimes to safe sex education, because activists can sometimes be more concerned with how things look than how things are. That's why they're activists. They have they are seeking a public spotlight to change the world, and that spotlight changes people. I mean, we all become different people when the camera's on. We just do. And so I'm disappointed with the history of gay men taking control of safe sex. But in 2008, this kid made a documentary about my sordid sex life. And suddenly I was invited to speak for the first time all over the country in Canada, small cities, conservative cities, and everywhere I went, outside New York City and San Francisco, everyone got it. It's like this generation,
Safe sex is like second nature. They just get it. They don't feel like it's an attack on their sexual identity or an attack on their sexual freedom. They understand that it's part of the world we live in. And so it was amazing to me to see how common, ordinary people, men and women, LGBTs, whatever, how it's just part of life, and they get it. Something happens when women are, when it's just men. Something happens. I'm not going to explain it, but something changes when you're in a world without women, and it's all men, and we don't always bring the best out on each other, and shit happens.
So I think that the gay community took up the message for using condoms. I think the gay community is using more condoms than heterosexuals. That's it's difficult.
Gay men use more condoms than heterosexuals?
Yes.
Ah, that'd be interesting. I don't.
That's,
We have more
my
STIs than
hypo-
heterosexuals.
We should see the sales of the company. Who are they selling to? I think that if you look at some surveys that shows that gay men use more condoms than heterosexuals.
I don't know.
And
I hope so. That's great.
And for example, there's another way of looking at it, is about embracements for, not desired embracement. So people, young women who are getting pregnant without knowing it. So that's a sign of not using condoms.
No, I
also.
think the statistics in America, I don't know about Spain, in America the statistics are actually pretty good. I mean, unwanted pregnancies, the rates are down. STIs among heterosexuals, down. Where there's a problem is poor communities, disenfranchised communities, urban gay men, and young people. That's really tragic because before a young person leaves their family and goes off to have their own adult life, it's a really dangerous time where people start to explore sexuality and they're not getting the messages. But I think we're getting close to the time where I'd like to throw it out to the audience and see what you think or what you want to know.
Yes, let's see. We have here a mic. So if somebody wants to ask or make a comment. Yes, there's a. Let me just mute the mic.
Take this.
Okay, yeah. So there was this discussion on using condoms, the condom usage for straight men and gay men. So that also varies from country to country. For example, in Pakistan, which is a developing country, we hear a lot of argument when the condom usage is being used among gay men. The argument is that you wouldn't get pregnant if I use if I don't use a condom. So culturally, I think in developing countries where people don't have understanding of HIV and AIDS in general, so the condom usage is more common amongst straight men who use it for contraception instead of gay men. So, and I think I could relate to a lot of things that you said when the whole process of advocating for change was beginning in the early 70s. This is something that is happening in Pakistan right now. I was doing an interview with people who were HIV positive in Pakistan, who were MSMs, men who have sex with men, and a lot of them were their physical condition was very weak. I mean, like they would do hard labor all day, and they were positive. And then I would ask them, why don't you take your ARTs? Since the adherence is very low in Pakistan, as low as 5%. So just people just discontinue the ARTs. So they would answer me that, if we take the ARTs, we have the severe side effects for a few weeks or even a month. How do you expect us to make a livelihood and take ARTs? So, I mean, like earlier on you said that you would say that PrEP is being used, is being advocated for people who are maybe not so economically stable. So this is something that is happening here as well in the developing countries, where people actually discontinue ARTs because their basic needs, their basic nutrition needs and economical needs are not being provided for.
That's important. Yeah, I agree. I'm not against PrEP. I worry that the whole PrEP thing started with the celebration of sex without condoms, and then when the attacks against those messages became relentless, the messengers changed the message to, oh, of course we mean PrEP with condoms. But, you know, a lot of gay men on condoms have the highest incidences of STIs, and PrEP is really important. It's a great intervention, you know, under the right circumstances for the right people. But the idea that gay men are all the same and they should all have PrEP because, you know, we're not all the same. You know, I mean, the whole point of gay liberation is we're not all the same, we don't have to be. But when there's a profit motive that's huge at stake, you know, it changes the message, it changes the advice, and that's why it's important for people who are sexually active to get informed.
Is there any other comment? Yes?
Well, I think I can speak about the reality here in Madrid and not any conference. So I think I see every day much more people who doesn't want to use a condom. So it's what I see in the...
Why do you think they don't want to use condoms?
There is a very big influence with the chemsex. So
Maybe they're on PrEP? I actually had a friend recently who was having sex with someone and literally just got penetrated, and he burst, you know, he pulled away from the guy and was like, well, aren't you on PrEP? And they hadn't even discussed it. So in certain circles, in certain communities, you know, the reason PrEP makes it possible for men to have 70 sex in terms of not having to talk when they're having hot impersonal sex. But in some places, it's become such a given that they just assume that everyone else that they play with is on it. And anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's...
But I'm saying I wouldn't be surprised if some people are noticing, people are noticing more bareback sex because of PrEP.
Yeah.
You know, which does protect against HIV, but may not be helpful, isn't helpful with other STIs.
Okay. Let us not forget also another aspect. I mean, we, after 35 years, I mean, if we look at our community, it's probably 30–40% of our community is already living with HIV. And most of them are on treatment, and they are undetectable. So probably we are seeing a mix, and I think that's the last part I want to talk about, you know, the new, what happens with the definition of safe sex, how it can be an evolution. It's a combination, but Diego.
What do you think, Richard? Because you were talking that in the 70s, there was this kind of sexual revolution where the people came out, they had fun, they really went to the saunas, they went to the bars where they could chat and have sex. And suddenly AIDS came, and fear. Do you remember the movie, it was Jeffrey? Do you remember that movie,
Yes.
Jeffrey? Where that guy was absolutely paralyzed because of the idea of getting AIDS, and he couldn't even have sex. So fear came over for a whole generation, and we were living with that fear for a long time. And condoms were the only shield we had to protect ourselves from death,
Right.
because it was death at that time. But it has changed completely. And this new generation, there is again a new gap, because they no longer have fear, because we no longer die. So we cannot keep on having the same messages we had before, saying, okay, sex can be dangerous, and sex can kill you. Now sex can kill you. If you're living with HIV, you can live kind of normal life.
Sex can still kill you.
Yeah,
but,
it can be dangerous, but it cannot kill you.
Right, it's
So
changed.
all this young generation, in a way, are celebrating again the idea of having sex without the sense of fear and the sense of culpability, of doing something that maybe is going to cost them, or they're going to pay.
Get it.
So we have to be aware of that,
Yeah.
that we have, again, a generation gap, a sexual revolution going on, mixed with drugs, like in the 70s. I mean, in the 70s was also drugs and sex. We are having the same thing. And we cannot have to the population the same messages we use, safe sex messages, that we used
I understand
before,
all that.
because the world and the AIDS world has changed.
Right.
So either we change in our messages and we change the story, or we won't be doing anything. That's my point. I don't know.
I agree with what you said, but I think you're really talking about a specific segment of the gay community. You know, people who have a roof over their head, people who have a job, people who have food, you know, people who, you know, work Monday to Friday and, you know, want to go crazy on the weekends. I totally get it. You know, and I think, you know, there's a lot of people I've known and know for whom PrEP is a lifesaver. But look at the statistics. It's like in America, like 80% of the cases, new HIV cases, are in gay men of color, are of gay men who live almost third world lives in the richest country in the world. Now, how do they feel when they hear white gay men talking about celebrating PrEP? I mean, and I celebrate PrEP, and I understand the importance of having a really great sex life. Hell, I wrote How to Have Sex in Epidemic in 1983. You know, I gave gay men the keys to go back to the baths. And that wasn't meant to last forever. It wasn't even meant to last 30 years. But when we talk about things like PrEP, and we talk about things like serial sorting, or there's so many ways that people have come up with to have unprotected sex in ways that reduce or eliminate risk. That's how we've gotten to the age of PrEP. And I embrace PrEP, not in the way it's being marketed, but I embrace it. But I wish with this new celebration and this new joy of sexuality that people would take some of that happiness and gratitude and do something with it to help other people for whom it's never going to be a party. That's all. I really wish that we would take the happiness and the celebration about the freedom that comes from PrEP and, you know, give something back. You know, I'm not saying gay men don't do that, but I can't talk about one without the other.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
I think that this celebration is not always always connected with PrEP, because in Spain we don't have PrEP.
I know that.
In Italy we don't have PrEP. In Germany we don't have PrEP.
But wait a sec, yeah.
PrEP is not widely available in England either, unless you buy it. And still we are celebrating sex, and still we are having a rise in the STIs. We are having all those things, and we don't have PrEP. So I don't think
No, that's
PrEP.
that's
I don't
tragic.
think that the sexual revolution we are living is because of PrEP. No, it's because we are no longer scared of death. I think this is the reason. And PrEP is a tool, as ARVs and many other things, and condoms.
Okay.
They are tools.
Okay.
But it's not PrEP, the thing that brought us, you know, the celebration of sex.
Okay.
I think it's the lack of fear.
Okay, activists need to go back to their governments where PrEP is not being funded and say, okay, when we first told you about PrEP, we were saying it replaced condoms. And you thought that was stupid. But now we realize you can't just use PrEP without condoms, that PrEP is a journey that people have to navigate on their own experience. And there are really important populations that can avoid HIV, life-changing infection with PrEP, no question about it. But that's not how it was sold to governments a couple of years ago. Because when it first was being sold, it was sold as the end of condoms. You know, so people need to go back to these governments and say, well, we've learned from our experience, and now we realize that that you need both. You know, and then gay men can figure out, when to use condoms and when not. But I think the way it was initially proposed to several governments, you know, they said, no, we don't buy this. You know, because there are health consequences to unprotected sex. You know, ask any woman, right?
Well, the other important thing is you talked about African Americans. They have the highest HIV rates, especially in the southern states of the United States. But the issue is not to compare one group to the other. I think it's how to get PrEP to the African American population. And I think there are some great community groups like in Chicago working on that and using the same Denver principles. I mean, by their own community, get it to their own community.
Yeah.
I think that would be very important.
I mean, I don't mean to sound just, go ahead. I don't mean to, like, I've made the mistake too as a white man, you know, to get passionate about issues without taking a moment to understand how they affect people who are different from me. And one of the great things about the LGBT movement is that because we're so diverse, there's always someone close by to tap you on the shoulder and say, well, what about African Americans, or what about poor people, or what about women? Or, I mean, that's one great thing about our movement, is that we're so diverse that when we get blinded to other people's experience who are also disenfranchised, you know, that's the point of the community, is to keep all of us more aware of how to make the world a better place and not to oppress each other the way we've been oppressed. But discussions about PrEP, you know, concern me because poverty in America is becoming an increasingly widespread experience, and things are getting worse economically and health-wise for a lot of people in America. And now with Trump, it's like a fucking nightmare. So yes, I care about PrEP, and I think it's something a lot of gay men can celebrate. But it's the history of our movement to take our joys and our achievements and then try to give something back. And I think this is the perfect time for that.
Hola, hola Richard, soy Kim Roqueta de Guys Positives. Quería...
Well, you were talking about the Denver principles and the community. I would like to say what's happening in the community. Are we also abandoning the real problems that we had been seeing with HIV years ago? And governments, we've got a lot of people coming to the government saying, you're not giving responses to realities. Not everyone has a fantastic life. Many times there are other problems. People have been suffering for 20, 30 years, and we've got to offer a solution. We've tried to see and how to work and tried to, for example, we had an apartment for HIV positive men that we've had to close, but sometimes people are always talking about PrEP, which is good and necessary, but we're not giving importance to realities, and there are very many topics that we need to discuss. These are not rare diseases. This is different. And there are a lot of aspects that need to be looked at. And in our community, we don't always talk about each aspect. We talk a lot about HIV, but...
So basically, how you look at the problems that still there's a lot of people living with HIV, and they have like very special problems which not always get outlined in the newspapers. People will have problems with housing. People may have problems with all other kinds of problems, which is quite difficult for some community organizations to work on that. So the question is, how do you see that? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, HIV is just one of many problems that are always worse in people who don't have access to decent health care. The way things are looking now, there's going to be a hell of a lot more of Americans, 24 million they're predicting right now if Trump's thing goes through. But whatever health problem a nation, a culture confronts is always experienced more brutally by people who don't have resources. And as gay people, I think we've done a good job of recognizing that among our own ranks are disenfranchised people that need extra help. That's all.
Buenos días.
Hello. Well, I'm from a country that's lost somewhere in the southern hemisphere where there is no PrEP, there's no public debate about PrEP or pre-treatment, and there's a study by the University of Chile which shows the difficulty of access and to preventionary measures to keep from contracting HIV, and there are no really public policies, as this study shows, for access to condoms. So what can we do with these younger populations? This is a study by the University of Chile that shows that countries where there are no preventive policies, no social policies for HIV, cause the subpopulations to be more at risk. And I'd like to ask you about your long history of action and activism. I heard you the first time talk about the first time you saw a condom. Well, most of us were already born into the condom culture. So the public policies of prevention, if they are there, can they also be felt as be something to feel proud of? Because many times I think that these AIDS and HIV policies are not seen as something to be proud of.
Policy from the prevention, and so the question for you is, you saw the first time people use condoms, and how do you, which value do you give to a government which may use the policy to promote the prevention? For example, now in the World Gay Pride we have now in Madrid, and if there's a lack or not of policy, prevention policy from part of the government, what's the role of the government in all of this?
I think it's a people's job to make the government accountable. It's activist jobs to make the government accountable. It's activist job to realize that whatever issue they're working on, to be sensitive to other people who are also disenfranchised, and to make sure that messages and pressure is, part of other groups that need addressing too. I mean, there's a lot of serious issues in healthcare in a lot of countries. There's religious barriers to getting safe sex education out, to getting things like PrEP approved, and the battle just goes on. I think it's up to people, not even activists, just ordinary people. Write a letter, make a phone call, get informed. I mean, the great thing about activism is that wherever you live, almost wherever you live, there are always struggling community groups, that need a day a month, a day a week. And you can make a difference by just, finding other people who care about this issue and getting involved, or finding local groups that desperately need help from people.
I just learned that if you put on your earphones, you have the translation into English. So it's almost time to wrap up, but if there's any other question, so you see, it doesn't matter if you speak in English or Spanish. Any other question? Yes? Okay. Have to do some exercise here.
Hi, I'm Nathan from Paris Ed Association. I would like to thank you for this presentation, for the context of the creation of the Denver Principle. I wanted to know if you had advices, because maybe we are preparing with a lot of groups of networks of people living with AIDS and KAP, Also a new declaration, kind of Denver Principles 2.0, that is internationally worked. Yeah, so we are doing it by internet, following the Delphi method, by quotation of proposals, and so I just wanted to know if you had advices for us. The declaration will be released during the IAS in July, so it's not finished yet. So, yeah.
I think it's, you know, it's great to recognize the work that's been done before, and there's nothing wrong with reiterating important points to remind people. I think you should celebrate the achievements of the Denver Principles in terms of making so many people aware of being empowered whenever they're in a situation with a healthcare provider, and even changing the way healthcare providers talk to their patients. So great change can come about when people band together to confront an issue, and the fact that we still have all this AIDS going on 35 years later is a disgrace. You know, and I think it's time to, you know, kick people's ass and recognize that things are not as bad as they were 30 years ago, but we're certainly not into the epidemic. And, you know, you have to address all the reasons why that is: economic, social, lack of education, and stigma, you know. And I think it's a great idea to do that. And also to, as alluded to in the Denver Principles, to always align yourself with other disenfranchised groups who have similar problems and issues that they're working on. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to thank you very much, Richard, for this very interesting conversation. And I would like to ask to give a hand to Richard. And thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. That means a lot to me. I'll just say in closing, this is the first AIDS conference I've been invited to since the Denver Principles in 1983. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so we probably move on to the next session. And I see that Julia, hello. Please come over here.